From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana.
The ayes to the right, 312. The noes to the left, 237. So the ayes have it, the ayes have it. Unlock.
It was a ping-pong match like no other.
Is it a desperate and unpopular Prime Minister threatening to keep some of us septuagenarians up all night if we do not bow to his will?
Peers had been warned on Monday that Tory MPs would sit all night if that's what it took to pass the Rwanda bill. After months of political wrangling and 5 bruising rounds of legislative ping-pong, it was a weary House of Lords that finally conceded just after midnight.
My Lords, this bill has now been scrutinised a number of times. The government have rejected this amendment several times, so we must now accept the will of the elected House and bring this debate on this last amendment to an end and get this bill onto the statute book.
Critics of the controversial bill have accused it of being not only expensive, but in breach of international law by labelling Rwanda, a country with a questionable human rights record, as a safe country without any need for further checks.
I think it's an awful bill. I think it's the worst bill I've seen in my 38 years in one or other House of Parliament.
This is costing the taxpayer £500 million for a scheme that will only cover 1% of asylum seekers. This is an extortionate scheme.
It was a bill that faced fierce criticism from even the Tory benches.
I believe the bill is fatally flawed. That's why I took the difficult decision earlier this year to vote against it in the Commons at third reading.
But for Rishi Sunak, this was finally a win on one of his key pledges, to stop the boats. And he's promised that deportations will begin this summer.
No ifs, no buts. These flights are going to Rwanda.
The Story today. Will Rishi's Rwanda policy actually work?
I'm Aubrey Allegretti, the chief political correspondent for The Times, making my second appearance on this podcast.
Well, welcome back. And Aubrey, you're normally in the corridors of power in Westminster. You were there on Monday night. Give us a sense of the atmosphere as you were walking through.
Certainly in the House of Lords, where all of the action was really concentrated, there was probably a sense of resignation. We saw the sort of slow retreats of peers who, first of all, were offered a concession on allowing people who serve with the armed forces in Afghanistan be exempt from this scheme. So first of all, we saw kind of the Commons successfully whittling it down to one amendment. And then in the final instance, the Lords having pushed repeatedly to try and get this independent sort of monitoring body set up to guarantee that Rwanda was a safe third country instead of just taking ministers' word for it, they decided not to press ahead with that amendment in the end. So there was that sense of resignation. I think most peers walked away from the House of Lords last night feeling like they had done their jobs very well, that they had scrutinised this legislation and performed the role that they are supposed to hold in our sort of slightly strange democratic setup.
The purpose of ping-pong is to persuade the government, through force of argument, to come to the table and agree a compromise. They have refused pointedly to do so, and after 4 rounds of ping-pong, their control of the Commons remains as solid as ever. The time has now come to acknowledge the primacy of the elected House and to withdraw from the fray.
And amongst the MPs, I think there was fervent jubilation, really, that this plan that they'd been pushing for 2 years was, they think, a significant step closer to succeeding.
This bill, as you say, the Rwanda bill, we've heard so much about for 2 years now, has been planned forever. There was a sense this week, though, that this was finally going to be the moment when it was passed. And some of that goes back to a slightly unusual press conference on Monday morning. I know you were there.
Good morning, Prime Minister. Thank you. Aubrey Allegretti from The Times.
Tell us what happened.
So we walked into the room, a sort of fairly hastily organised press conference. Again, they have been preparing for this moment for weeks, and I think they'd intended for that press conference to come at various moments earlier in the month. But the group of Westminster journalists all traipsed into the room. We were first greeted by this new emblazoned logo on one of the very shiny screens that they have installed since refurbishing that room to the tune of nearly £3 million. But it features this big stamp saying "Stop" underneath the boats. So obviously repeating the slogan that Rishi Sunak has made famous, but it's sort of once more with feeling. I felt like I'd read it so many times, and was this the moment where he was going to really stop the boats? And during that press conference, the Prime Minister basically admitted for the first time that he's not going to meet his deadline of sending these flights off by spring. Really significant, because that is something he has stuck to for months and months and months. So, first of all, it could be used against him to challenge the government and say, well, you failed to do this when you said you would. How can we possibly trust you going forward? But he did say that that was because the House of Lords had held up this legislation, and he specifically singled out Labour.
For almost 2 years, our opponents have used every trick in the book to block flights and keep the boats coming. But enough is enough.
Now, there are obviously lots of opposition parties in the House of Lords, and the Conservatives are the largest political party in the House of Lords, but they don't have a majority, which means they're really at the whims of the crossbenchers, those apolitical peers who scrutinise legislation and don't get whipped on party political lines.
So they are non-political in every way.
Exactly.
And often the reason they're there is they are experts in their field.
Certainly. So they are people who are very much designed to, like you said, be experts in their field and add their experience, all of their years of knowledge, and sort of they're a buffer against political parties just using the House of Lords as a sort of second House of Commons chamber. It's supposed to be about that concentration of expertise. So Rishi Sunak very, very clearly trying to draw some battle lines, no doubt, with the local elections in mind in a few weeks, and blaming Labour specifically for this delay. And so all of that was unveiled by the Prime Minister on Monday, with the intention of basically saying, we want flights to continue with this regular rhythm over a period of months until the boats stop, in the Prime Minister's words. In other words, we could get a plane in the sky faster, possibly in June, but we don't want to, because we don't just want the first plane to go. We want to be ready for the second and third and fourth to follow quickly afterwards.
And Aubrey, as you said, Rishi Sunak was keen to point out that Labour was holding this up in the House of Lords. Actually, a lot of the opposition was coming from those crossbench peers, those experts in their field. Just talk us through the parliamentary ping-pong, as it's called, that's gone on over the last few weeks. How many times has it been back and forth between the Commons and Lords? And why have the Lords been so keen to hold it up?
So normally what happens, I suppose the normal passage of a bill is that it has about 5 or 6 stages in the House of Commons, and then it goes to the House of Lords, where it repeats those 5 or 6 stages, but effectively with different people who bring different things to the table. And the Lords can then sometimes vote and add amendments to a piece of legislation, and then send it back to the Commons. Sometimes those amendments are accepted, and that's kind of where the battle ends. But in this case, there's been a really significant kind of back and forth where the government and the Commons has been refusing to accept any amendments. So each time they're inserted, it gets ping-ponged back to the House of Commons. The Commons disagrees with the Lords' amendments, which means it's then sent back in its kind of unamended original forms in the House of Lords, and the Lords go, no, thank you, we're not having this. We'll re-add the amendments that we wanted to. And there is normally some debate around it, but even some of the MPs in the chamber were getting frustrated yesterday. Quite a lot of the Conservatives and even some Labour MPs were basically saying, there is very little new to say. What are we debating here? We've debated this for literally 2 years now, so there's very little new to add. And so, yes, this issue has been sort of shuttling backwards and forwards from both ends of the Houses of Parliament. And it finally came, if you like, to an end when the Lords decided, 1, to accept what's been described by some as a compromise, and 2, not to push their Second Amendment to a vote for a final time.
So it's now passed. Just take us back. This policy was very controversial. This bill was too. Just explain what exactly this bill was trying to achieve.
So effectively, this bill was trying to assuage the concerns of the Supreme Court, which around 6 months ago said that the policy was unlawful because of a few reasons. First of all, the risk of migrants who the UK would send to Rwanda potentially being mistreated and then sent elsewhere. So effectively the UK being complicit in that process. And then also that Rwanda itself had not been demonstrated to be a safe third country that the UK could make these removals to. And so what this bill was effectively trying to do was say in legislation to the courts, Rwanda is a safe third country and you should disregard the judgments of the European Convention on the Human Rights relating to this area, i.e., listen to us as ministers. Now, the reason it's so controversial is because ministers are really sort of dabbling in the world of the judiciary. Normally, ministers make the laws and judges and the courts decide how to enforce them. And there's a very strict separation of powers, which makes the UK one of the sort of leading countries for being arbiters of the rule of law. And it's a system which we obviously try and espouse to other countries and tell them to replicate. So it's been a difficult position for the UK to try and maintain on the world stage. And the UK has obviously been accused of breaching international law in this instance, not for the first time. So it's been a very tricky issue for the government to navigate, not least because of the tensions within the Conservative Party. In the hours before this bill successfully passed, there was 2 Conservative rebels who voted for the amendments. Robert Buckland, the former Justice Secretary, who voted for both, and Jeremy Wright, the former Attorney General, who voted for one of them. So there are still concerns, deep concerns amongst senior Conservatives, but I think they've basically decided that they've lost the battle on this one.
So this bill was to try and finally make the policy workable because the courts had kept stopping it. Take us back to where this policy comes from. You know, as you say, Rishi Sunak at the moment is making it the policy he's judged on, stopping the boats, sending people to Rwanda. But it was actually introduced by Boris Johnson back in 2022. And I know you were there for the launch of this big idea. Take us back. Where was this and what was happening?
Yes, it was on a morning of the 14th of April 2022 when, again, with quite a lot of secrecy, Westminster journalists were told to head to an airport, Ashford London Airport in Kent. And there we were greeted by this sight of, it was a beautifully sort of clear blue sky day. And we were walking along the tarmac of this airport towards one of the hangars past all these kind of private and old planes. And we were all seated waiting for Prime Minister Boris Johnson to come out and address us. And it was there that he announced this policy, which at the time was incredibly controversial by his and the government's own admission. Very novel, never been sort of tried in this way before by the UK, and a real departure to tackle a problem that had really sort of plagued the government for at least the last 4 or 5 years. People remember, first of all, there was the issue with migrants trying to climb into lorries at Calais and come across on commercial ferries and in the back of lorries, which caused a lot of angst to some of the lorry drivers. Then there was this issue of people using small boats, effectively taking their life in their own hands, paying people smugglers to take them across the English Channel in really flimsy dinghies, often overcrowded, often poorly constructed, sometimes that would sink, sometimes leading to deaths in the English Channel. And so that's what this policy sort of aimed to address, was creating a deterrent, which would basically say to people, well, if you cross the Channel, you'll only be sent back to the East African country of Rwanda, you'll have wasted all of your money, and then you'll be potentially even further from home than you were before.
How did it go down at that big press conference?
So I think it took quite a long time to sink in. And I remember specifically asking about the cost factor, because I spoke to some Conservative MPs who were nervous about this policy. They said, is this a value for money scheme? We're supposed to be the Conservative Party. You know, we're supposed to be about value for money for taxpayers. If we're spending potentially hundreds of millions of pounds on this scheme, what are we getting for it? How many people are we going to remove? Is it going to have the effects that the government thinks it will, but has no evidence for being able to say that it definitively has in the past? So I remember asking Boris Johnson effectively, you know, what's the cost rationale for this? How can you square using taxpayers' money on this scheme with no evidence that it's going to work? And won't it sort of become an endless sort of pot of money that you have to pay out? What is the end goal here? But the Prime Minister at the time, Boris Johnson, was really ebullient. The Home Secretary as well was Priti Patel. Again, I think some people forget this was kind of her idea. And I think at that point there was real optimism that this was a scheme that could be replicated with other countries by the UK. So while it was going to be a limited pool of sending a couple of 100 or 1,000 people in the first few months, that actually it would open the door to other countries who would then potentially say, hey, we like the look of that, we fancy the money as well, and we can help. We have a country that could host these people, so we'd like to join as well. So that it was really the sort of the petri dish, the test case for what the UK government could then be a much wider expanded scheme.
That optimism for this new policy faded fast. It was introduced, as you say, in April 22. By June 2022, the first flight deporting people to Rwanda was ready, it was on the tarmac, but it didn't go. Just remind us what happened.
It was really dramatic, really, because we had there was almost this fanfare built up around the first flight being ready to take off in mid-June 2022. So only 3 months after the policy was announced, almost to the day. And there were 7 people who were sitting in a plane on the tarmac waiting to be removed. But they had effectively sought to block their removal by appealing to the ECHR, the European Court of Human Rights. And they were basically saying that the removals were to a dangerous country, and that the UK courts should look at this issue of whether or not it was safe to do so. Because what the ECHR did was not block this policy entirely. It basically said, we're going to suspend you being able to do this until the UK courts have authorised it and given their say-so.
That was the first of many, many legal challenges. It was followed by decisions from the Court of Appeal and then the Supreme Court. Talk us through that process. What did they say?
So the government, understandably, sought to try and push through with this policy because they felt initially that the High Court's ruling was wrong and they wanted to challenge it. So they were challenging it within the British legal system. They were having these debates on the terms that they wanted. It wasn't about what Rishi Sunak would call a foreign court or an international court, the ECHR. This was about UK judges deciding about UK legislation. And one of the funny things that we sort of got into so much during that period where it was going through the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court was this issue of international law and international obligations, things like the commitments that the UK has signed up to under the European Convention on Human Rights and UN human rights agreements as well. There are literally laws which say that we should follow these rulings. So people were saying, well, if you want to really get to the source of this, then what you really need to do is start disapplying or undoing some of that old law that gives effect to these binding international commitments the UK has signed up to. So that's where we got into a really sort of messy rigmarole, and the government effectively decided that it needed to do something as wide and as blanket as possible. And it really speaks to why they've been so unwilling to compromise when it comes to this piece of legislation, which is the Safety of Rwanda Bill, because we have had 3 pieces of legislation which attempts to unblock this. We had the Nationality and Borders Act, we had the Illegal Migration Act, and now finally we've had the Safety of Rwanda Act. We've had 3 pieces of legislation which are designed to try and unblock the Rwanda scheme and get flights in the air, and the previous 2 had failed, which is why ministers said this needs to be so hard, we need to go so far, and we cannot have any small fragment of amendment or anything that could weaken it, because effectively they knew politically, electorally, this was their last chance. They haven't got any more time to get legislation through the House of Commons. Rishi Sunak called this emergency legislation, and it's taken 5 months. They don't have a 4th shot at this.
So, Aubrey, this bill is now going to be made law very soon. When it does kick in, just talk us through those practicalities of how it'll actually work. Will this apply to everybody entering the country illegally? Who would be sent to Rwanda?
So this policy is designed to remove only people who arrive, what we would say in the UK as irregularly, but what the government would describe as illegally. And so most often that is by small boats, people paying people smugglers to take them across the English Channel in these really flimsy dinghies, who often get picked up by Border Force or the Coast Guard or the RNLI and escorted to or provided safety so that they can come back to the UK. Obviously, the numbers this year have already been significantly high. They stand at about 6,000 people who've arrived by small boat this year. Again, looking at that trend of numbers is really interesting. In 2023, the government signalled that it was making significant progress because it said that cumulatively, year on year, arrivals by small boat were down by around a third. And the government was able to sort of claim some success. The problem was that Rishi Sunak had almost created a rod for his own back by saying that he would stop the boats. The famous slogan we've all become familiar with is stop the boats. It's not reduce the boats. It's about stopping them completely.
We are introducing new legislation to keep my promise to you, to stop the boats. My policy is very simple. It is this country and your government who should decide who comes here and not criminal gangs.
So there are about 52,000 people currently in the UK who'll be caught up in this. They are people who arrived in the UK irregularly, the government would say illegally. So there is a really big pool of people that we're talking about, but these are effectively asylum seekers. But they have, in all cases it seems, crossed through other safe countries to get here. And that's why the government argues they're ineligible to be kind of treated as asylum seekers or refugees on British soil, and it's going to process their claims in Rwanda. Because it says, if you've left the country where you were at risk and you have passed through another safe country, like France, then you have no right to be able to claim refugee status or claim asylum when you get to the UK.
Are there still legal challenges that will stop some of these people being deported to Rwanda, despite this new bill, which is supposed to overcome them all?
There certainly will be. And that's partly why Rishi Sunak has pushed the start date for this scheme well into the coming months. It's not going to happen as soon as it possibly could because he wants to allow time for those legal challenges to take place. He doesn't want the government to be seen as being thwarted in any way. He anticipates legal challenges. So I understand that there'll be probably a judicial review launched by as soon as next Tuesday. And that's the point at which, lawyers will get involved. They'll again start escalating up through the domestic courts, the High Court, the Court of Appeal, potentially the Supreme Court. And it's where there will be this sort of real fireworks. We've seen all the fireworks playing out in Parliament over the politics of this. This is where the fireworks break out in the courts over the legal aspect. Are judges going to want to be told to disregard parts of human rights law that the UK has signed up to under the European Convention on Human Rights? So effectively the government has baked in time for those judicial reviews and legal challenges and appeals. It still thinks it can be successful in getting flights off the ground in 10 to 12 weeks, which is effectively the start of July.
That big legal battle that's coming is one that's been fought already, really, within the Tory party. We've had objections from, as you said, sort of a few of the MPs, Robert Buckland, Suella Braverman, who's not exactly against sending people to Rwanda. She said it would be her great dream. But because they don't think this will work in its current guise, and one of the reasons they say that is the ECHR, just explain why that is and what Rishi Sunak might do about that in the future. Absolutely.
So there's been really this internal battle raging in the Conservative Party for at least 12 months, but more sort of 2 years, ever since the ECHR stepped in to block these flights taking off, about whether or not the sort of system of international human rights law that governs refugee status and asylum claims is fit for purpose in the 21st century. It was conceived by Britain and other countries in the aftermath of the Second World War. But some critics, especially in the Conservative Party, say that it didn't anticipate huge migration flows like we're seeing today, with people being displaced for war, for famine, for climate change reasons. And so there is an envisaging of whether or not the UK could alter its relationship with the ECHR or potentially leave the ECHR. There are some Conservatives who see it as electorally a very helpful issue for the Conservatives to be campaigning on at the next election. They want to turn it into almost a second Brexit to motivate people to turn out to vote when you will have high levels of apathy amongst Conservative-minded voters at the next election. They think it would be a really helpful way to convince people to get off their sofa or to leave work early and go to the ballot box and vote for the Conservatives.
A lot of this will rest on the European Convention of Human Rights, though, the ECHR. I know that's something you actually asked the Prime Minister about.
If you do manage to start the flights to Rwanda, does that mean that the UK won't need to leave the ECHR?
So I'm confident that we're acting in a way that's completely compliant with all our international obligations, and we work very hard to deliver that.
Ever since there have been these kind of clarion calls from some senior Conservatives for the UK to re-examine its relationship with or pull out of the ECHR, the Prime Minister has understood that he needs to keep MPs on side, and he has to sort of show a little bit of ankle to them by not dismissing it out of hand. Now, I do think still that it's incredibly unlikely that it's a position the government ends up taking, but it is one the Prime Minister has left open the possibility of before, and he did so again when I asked him about this at the press conference on Monday.
If it ever comes to a choice between our national security, securing our borders, and membership of a foreign court, I'm of course always going to prioritise our national security. That's the right thing for the British Prime Minister to do, and that's what I would do.
Would he face a rebellion within his own cabinet, though, if he went ahead with it?
He certainly would. One of the reasons that I wanted to ask about it is because you had some interesting figures in the room at the press conference, along with the journalists. In the front row, you had 5 ministers sat watching Rishi Sunak. You had Andrew Mitchell, the Deputy Foreign Secretary. You had Victoria Prentice, the Attorney General. Both of them thought to be very sort of one nation minded and likely to be very uncomfortable with discussion about the UK pulling out of the ECHR. You also had people there like James Cleverly, the Home Secretary, Grat Shapps, the Defence Secretary, and Michael Tomlinson, the so-called illegal migration minister. But in that room, you could almost feel and see the split on the issue of the ECHR. And it's why Rishi Sunak was so ambiguous in his reply to me.
It does feel like that really does split the party. Is there a danger that this, Rishi Sunak has turned Rwanda into such a big part of his premiership? It's one of the pledges, stopping boats, but doing it via the Rwanda policy. It's split so much of the party. He's somehow ended up in a position where he's angered the right, the Suella Bravermans who think this doesn't go far enough, but also angered the left by potentially contravening international law. Was it worth it?
I think to give Rishi Sunak credit, to have been in a position where there was only 1 or 2 rebellions in the final vote on this, it does show that he has managed to get the party into line, whether willingly or because the fight has gone out of them. And even on Tuesday, the One Nation Conservative group, which traditionally I think was most concerned about this policy, was saying it's just got to happen as soon as possible. So I genuinely think, as a means of keeping his MPs together, he has handled this issue relatively well. Now, that's one part of this. The other part of it is what does the electorate think of it and what do Conservative voters think of it? And it's there that, the situation is far more complex and he might not get anywhere near the same amount of kind of reward or dividends when it gets to the general election. Immigration is still not a sort of highly salient issue for all voters. It certainly is for some groups of voters, particularly more so those who are minded to vote for Reform, a party viewed of being much stronger on immigration and to the right of the Conservative Party, very slowly easing into its vote share, sort of nudging up to 15-16% in the national polls, although still struggling to make any significant breakthroughs in terms of seats in Parliament or on councils. But there is also that question of how 2019 Conservative voters view this policy and the issue of immigration. And all the evidence is, if you speak to people like John Curtis, the sort of polling guru, is that immigration just doesn't hold high enough salience for the government to be putting all its eggs in this single basket. They're much more likely to be focused on public services, the economy, and taxes. And so there's questions about whether or not Rishi Sunak is really pursuing the right kind of policy aims and goals that voters will thank him for in 6 months' time.
I mean, even if you just look at the 5 pledges he has publicised, there are some on the economy, on inflation, on the things that really do affect people's everyday lives. And yet it has felt like he's become obsessed with this one. We heard that he was almost micromanaging the policy through its various stages. Why do you think this matters so much for him? And will this now finally be a victory for Rishi Sunak?
There are some who think that Rishi Sunak knows he's going to lose the next election and is focused on legacy building, i.e. what he wants to be remembered for. And there's probably a limited amount that the government thinks it can achieve with things like public services, which speaks to point 4 of his 5 pledges, which was cut waiting lists, which obviously hasn't succeeded, and the other 3 pledges, which are to do with the economy. So I suspect that Rishi Sunak sees, one big challenge ahead that he still thinks that he can fix or at least make significant progress on. But we hear so much less about the 5 pledges these days. I literally can't remember the last time I heard them, and there was one point at which the government was so obsessed with them, it put them at the top of every press release. You'd get a press release from the Environment Department about, grey squirrels, and it would say the 5 pledges at the top. So they really wanted to hammer those home at one point. These days, nobody in government is keen to talk about all of them in the same way.
That was Aubrey Allegretti, chief political correspondent at The Times. When he's not in our studio recording a podcast, he's down in Westminster finding the big political stories of the day, like uncovering the Westminster honey trappers who tricked MPs. If you haven't heard that episode, do go back and have a listen. You can find all of his reporting at thetimes.co.uk with a subscription or in print. The producers today were Priyanka Deladia and Ed Halford. The executive producer was Kate Ford, and sound design was by Mal Lassetto. If you'd like to get in touch with us, do drop us a line to thestory@thetimes.co.uk. And if you enjoyed this episode, if you learnt anything from it, then do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. We read every one of them. Thanks for listening. See you tomorrow.